What do you do when you look back at the events and moments of your life? Or perhaps I should ask, what do you see when you look back at those moments? Oftentimes, for me personally, I can look back and I can see regret. I can see some happiness and some joy. I can see times where I was strong and times where I needed the strength of others. Many times, and I would venture to say most times, when we look back at the moments of our life, we see a conglomeration of good and bad, a playlist of both our best and worst moments. And yet, no matter what your point of view, there is one perspective that you can look back and see a constant. Because when we look back at our lives, we can see that God is always working. As we dive into Genesis chapter 48, we will be seeing the faithfulness of God as a theme throughout this passage as we look and see the end of Jacob's life, or at least coming very close on that. If you have a Bible like I do, one of the Pew Bibles, I want to encourage you to turn with me to Genesis 48. That should be on page 52. There are a couple different versions of these Bibles out there, so it might be a page or two off, but the chapter is still the same. Nonetheless, we will be on Genesis chapter 48. Let's read as we start in verse 1. Sometime later, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, along with him. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you," Israel rallied his strength and sat up on the bed. Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and there he blessed me and said to me, 'I am going to make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I will make you a community of peoples, and I will give you this land as an everlasting possession to your descendants after you.' Now then, your 2 sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you here will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Any children born to you after them will be yours, and the territory they inherit, they will be reckoned under the names of their brothers. As I was returning from Paddan Aram, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan while we were still on the way, a little distance from Ephrath. So I buried her there beside the road to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem." And we're going to pause there. We see from the get-go a continuation of the story that we have been talking about. Following the story of Abraham and his family, called by God to go to the land of Canaan and to inherit that land. Abraham was promised that he would be blessed, that he would be fruitful and multiply, that a people would come from him, that the land would be given to him, and that through that, an offspring would come, one that would deliver the world from sin and from evil. And so we follow Abraham's family with this promise being repeated over and over again. Abraham's son Isaac, God a repeat of the promise. Jacob, God a repeat of the promise, and at the same time, name was changed to Israel. And finally, we see Joseph, who we have been following for a while. Joseph, the one who was sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt, who, by the grace of God and through God's faithfulness, worked his way up to become the second in command over all of Egypt, and by God's grace, able to save the world by being used by God to see this famine that was come, and to stockpile and to feed people during this time of hardship, including bringing his family down to Egypt with him. So, sometime later, approximately 17 years later, Joseph is told that his father, who had moved with him, is ill. Now, Jacob, his father, was around 147 years old at this point. So my assumption is if you're ill at that age, the signs probably are not looking very good. So he immediately comes with his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to visit his father, Jacob. So Jacob is told, as we see in verse 2, that his son is coming to see him. And he rallies his strength and he sits up in his bed. Now, an interesting thing to note here is oftentimes in the book of Genesis, specifically in these later chapters, Jacob is mentioned to be both Jacob and Israel, oftentimes flipping between the two names, seemingly at a whim. And yet here we see power usage. You see, Jacob, the father, is ill, and he is told that Joseph has come to see him. And yet, who is the one who gathers the strength to rise up? It is Israel. The strength of God, the name that God renamed him to, the one that means to struggle with God, rallied his strength and sat up in his bed. He is sick, his life is coming to an end, and he greets his son. So, verse 3, as we read earlier, Jacob says to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and there he blessed me. You see, Jacob goes back, looks at his life, and recounts the history that he went through. Specifically, the moment when he was on his way back from the land where he worked for his uncle. When he was coming back to see his father and his family, he had an encounter with God. And in that encounter, God renamed him. God regave the promise that had been given to his family. And God identified himself as God Almighty. This idea that he is powerful, that he is in control of all, and that he can determine the course of human history. This phrase, God Almighty, is the same one used in this conversation that Jacob is relaying. And he mentions Luz, the land of Canaan, the town of Bethel in particular. And he references the promises that he will make him fruitful, that he will increase your numbers, that he will make him a community of peoples, and he will give you the land as an everlasting possession to your descendants. These are the promises that God promised to Jacob, that God promised to Abraham, and that God is continuing to over and over again. Now imagine if you were Jacob at this point in your life. You know your life is coming to an end. You know your father and your grandfather had longer lives and arguably less eventful lives. And you had been told by both of them of this promise that God has given. His grandfather, Abraham, had one son through whom the promise was carried on, Isaac. His father, Isaac, had one son through whom the promise was carried on, Jacob. Now, to them, it might have seemed like quite the stretch to say that God would grant them a multitude of peoples, that God would make them fruitful and multiply, right? I mean, how can a nation come from Abraham if he only has one kid whom God says the nation will come from? And how about that kid only having one kid likewise? Of course, they each had other sons and daughters. But God made it clear that the promise was going through these. No doubt in Jacob's mind, he is thinking through this as he looks at his 11th son and his 2 grandkids, all of whom would inherit the promise to a degree. He looks out and he sees that God has remembered his promise to make him fruitful and multiply. Granted, Jacob sees that on his own in big part. But he looks out and he sees his kids and his grandkids, and I can imagine his heart being full of warmth at this. He looks and he sees, I will make you a community of peoples. By the way, a community of peoples that moved to the land of Egypt and settled in the land of Goshen, were given a job by the Pharaoh himself. and that there would be a land that they would return to. So he looks back at his life and he remembers God's promise and looks forward and sees, hey, this promise, it's not going unfulfilled. This promise that God made to my grandfather, to my father, to me, is continuing on in you. This is big. The blessings fulfilled, God holding up his end of the promise and being the God of promises himself. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, Jacob makes a shocking claim in verse 5. He says, "Now then," speaking to Joseph, "your 2 sons born to you here in Egypt, before I came to you, will be reckoned as mine." In essence, what Jacob is doing here is going through an adoption ceremony, saying, you know what, your kids, they will actually take part in the inheritance that I am passing down. This, at first, might seem like he is jilting Joseph, saying, hey, your kids, no, they're not your kids, they're mine. But truly, it is a blessing to say, the inheritance that I'm giving to all of your brothers, I'm giving to your sons as well. So he goes on and says, Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are. Interesting that he called out those 2. If you remember, Reuben and Simeon were Jacob's firstborn. And yet that is who Ephraim and Manasseh are being likened to. Also, if you remember, both Reuben and Simeon disqualified themselves from the inheritance and the birthright through their actions. Simeon, along with Levi, through committing a genocide against the town of Shechem. And Reuben, through taking irresponsible action and sleeping with his father's other wife. It is almost as if here Jacob is saying, you know what, your sons who were born to you through your faithfulness and sticking with God, through persevering through all that you have went through, looking back at God's faithfulness as he continues to work through your life and through mine. Because of that, your sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, will be counted as mine. And to a degree, will take their role as birthright. So, he makes this claim, he makes this adoption ceremony, as he has the right to do, and he reemphasizes, hey, any kids that you have also after these 2, they will be counted as yours, and they will take part of the inheritance that Ephraim and Manasseh are going to get. Again, this is a bold claim. This is a doling out of blessing on Joseph and his family. And yet, again, seemingly out of nowhere, just as quickly as the adoption ceremony began, it seems to end, as Jacob recounts another part of his life. First, we saw him remembering God's promise and probably seeing the fulfillment of it in his son and grandkids. But then in verse 7, he mentions him returning from Paddan and his favorite wife passing away, Rachel. Rachel, the one who was Joseph's mother, who was the biological grandmother of Ephraim and Manasseh. He recounts this in the midst of these wondrous times, looking back at life, seeing the joys and fulfillments of God's promises, but also the sorrows of life. Now, some commentators have made the claim that this part was maybe added later, or that it doesn't seem to fit with the context. However, to me, it makes sense. Jacob, at the end of his life, is going through both the highs and the lows, the joys and the sorrows, the praises and the regrets. And he mentions them. I've had conversations with family who are on the verge of passing in the past, and the conversations do feel often a lot like this, recounting the good and recounting the bad. And yet in the midst of this, as we saw in the beginning, a focus of Jacob, a focus of Israel in this time, in looking at the ups and downs of his life is to remember God's promise, to remember his faithfulness. So I want to ask you, how do you see God working in your life? I want us all to be looking back, and we'll have this question going through every part of our message for the day. How do you see God working in your life as you look back? Because we don't have to be at the end to look and see how God has worked, to look back and see the ups and downs of our experience and the stability of God's faithfulness. So, how do you see God working in your life? Specifically, as we see in this section, through the ups and the downs, through the highs and the lows, and the good and the bad. Do you see God's faithfulness? Do you see God working in your life? Oftentimes it can be tough. It can be challenging to actually know. However, look at the promises that God has blessed you with. Look at the things that God has been alongside you with, and look back and think through, has he given me shelter? Do I have those around who care for me? Have I felt the love of God? And my conviction is that if we truly look, we will see God's fingerprints everywhere. All too easy to ignore in the midst of our own waves. And yet when we actually take the time to look, it can be one of the more encouraging sentiments in both the good and the bad. So ask yourself, in the good and the bad, how do you see God working in your life? As we mull on that question, I want to move to the next section, starting in verse 8. Because our story continues. In verse 8, it says, when Israel saw the sons of Joseph, he asked, who are these? They are the sons God has given me here, Joseph said to his father. Then Israel said, bring them to me, so I may bless them. Now, Israel's eyes were failing because of old age, and he could hardly see. So Joseph brought his sons close to him, and his father kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face again. And now, God has allowed me to see your children too. Then Joseph removed them from Israel's knees and bowed down with his face to the ground. And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim on his right toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh on his left toward Israel's right hand, and brought them close to him. But Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger. And crossing his arms, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, may the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth. We're going to pause here as we see a blessing poured out on these two young men. Now, as a way to place some context for this, by this time, we know that Ephraim and Manasseh are probably in their 20s. At the youngest, they are 20 and 21. At the oldest, they are 28 and 29. Based on the timeline that we know, based on the fact that they were born during the prosperous time, thank you, during the prosperous time when the grain was flowing, 7 years after that, and of famine, and the time that Jacob and his family moved to Egypt. So these are not young boys at this time. These are not unknown men to Jacob. So why then, when Israel sees Ephraim and Manasseh, does he say, who are these? You see, a lot of scholars actually will point to this and say, well, this was actually probably something that happened earlier, and Moses is conveying it out of order. which, to be fair, sometimes the Bible does that. And yet, again, it makes sense. Because in verse 10, we see that Israel was, in a sense, legally blind. He could still see up close, but from afar, he couldn't make out the details. And so he was told that Joseph is coming, and he sees Joseph approach with two others who he can't quite tell. So he asks, "Who are these?" And, well, they're the sons God has given me here, Ephraim and Manasseh. And Israel asks, "Well, I want to bless them." Now, this is important. This blessing ritual, as we have talked about all throughout the book of Genesis, it conveys more than just will. It's more than just saying, "Oh, I hope that your life goes well." That there is actually something to this. First off, the conveying of an inheritance and a birthright, an important family trend and family tradition that carries on. But we also see that oftentimes these blessings have some sort of divine inspiration behind them. Whether God gave the blessing to the patriarch to speak, or whether God is making that real, this blessing has impact to it. It has meaning more than just words on a page. So, Israel wants to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, his two new adopted sons. So, Joseph brings them close, and Jacob embraces them, brings them close, kisses them, and hugs them. I think it's important here, actually, that the order is mentioned, as the embrace is not going to be interrupted. Israel, looking back on his life once again, says, "I never expected to see you." Years and years before, he was told that Joseph was dead, killed by some animal. And yet, after many years, he was reunited with his son and got to spend the last bundle of years with his son. And he makes this statement, "I had never expected to see your face again, and now God has allowed me to see your children too." Again, looking at the promise that he would be fruitful and multiply, that there would be a peoples coming from him. He can look and see this promise is being fulfilled because not only does he see his 11th son, but he also sees his grandchildren as well. It is also interesting to me throughout this, the emphasis on God. Remember, life is up and down. But Joseph, in verse 9, claims that these are the sons God has given me in Egypt. Jacob, in verse 11, says, "God has allowed me to see your children." There's this focus that oftentimes can be missed. To realize that the blessings that Jacob and Joseph have attained came from God himself. As I said, they looked throughout their lives and they could see all the ups and downs, but the fingerprints of God's faithfulness are consistent throughout. So, Joseph removes them from his father's knees. Joseph pays homage to his father by bowing down to the ground. And that's actually an interesting note, too. Joseph, the one who is second in command over all Egypt, the one who, from an early age, was given in a dream the idea that all of his family would bow down to him at the peak of his life, at the peak of his authority, bows down to his father, giving him the respect. So he bows to the ground. And afterwards, he grabs his children, lines them up, brings them before Jacob in order that he would bless them. Now, the order here emphasizes is specific because typically the right hand would be the hand used to convey the blessing of the firstborn, and the left hand used to convey the other blessing. And so Joseph lines the kids up so that Manasseh, the firstborn, will be on Jacob's right hand and Ephraim on his left. To which Jacob, who he cannot see, crosses his arms. Now, whether or not he assumed maybe, Jacob or Joseph brought them mixed up because, left, right, back, forward, looking in a mirror, all that can be very confusing sometimes, at least for me. I don't know about you guys. But he brings his sons forward, and Israel crosses his hands and puts his right hand on Ephraim, and he gives a blessing. Notice verse 15, though. He doesn't bless the children specifically. It says that he blesses Joseph. Again, this is not overstepping Joseph's role in the birthright, in the blessing. This is including him in it, giving him a double taste of this. Saying, you know what, both of your kids, through you are they going to be blessed. So he blesses Joseph and says, may the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all the day of my life, and the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. Let me rephrase this. May the God before whom my fathers walked, and the God who walked with me, and the God who protected me, bless them. There's oftentimes been a delineation in Jacob's life where God is the God of his fathers. For most of his life, that's how he called God, the God of my father Abraham and the God of my father Isaac. For most of his life, it wasn't his God. He looks back and he sees Abraham and Isaac, his parents, his father and his grandfather, walking with God, intentionally following through with him, living a life of faithfulness in the midst of hardship, even when they stumble. And yet, he makes a claim, in a sense, admitting that he walked with God by saying, yeah, God walked with me. God was beside me. Some of you might know the popular Christian poem, Footprints in the Sand, where a man is walking with Jesus. He sees two sets of footprints, his and Jesus' own. And he looks back in the hardest times of his life, and he only sees one. And he asks God, where were you during those times when I was struggling? To which he says, the time when you see one footprint or one set of prints, that's when I carried you. When we look at the times for Abraham and Isaac, that rings so true. They walked with God, and God carried them along the way. However, as I was told by a professor in college, there's a parody of that poem called Butt Prints in the Sand, because there are some people who God has to drag along with him. I was planning on reading it to you guys, but I could not get through it without laughing, so I'm just going to summarize it with that. And maybe encourage you guys to look it up afterwards, because it's worth it. And to me, that feels more like Jacob. See, Jacob didn't oftentimes walk with God, and yet God was with him the entire way, oftentimes dragging him along with his plans, until Jacob came to God as well. And by the way, how often is that us? More often than I'd like to admit, personally. But he makes this claim, and this, I believe, beautiful claim, that even when he was not walking with God, God was still there for him. Even when he was struggling, even when he was rebelling, God was guiding him. In the midst of his self-inflicted pain, by stealing twice from his brother and having to run away for fear of his life. In the midst of the pain of tricking his uncle. In the midst of his pain of marrying two women, getting two other wives, and having the war with children that came through that. God was with him. Throughout all of this, God was faithful. And he looks back at his life, and I could see him walking through. I could see him considering what is happening here, the traces of faithfulness, to look at God creating the earth, God blessing Abraham and guiding him throughout his life. To look at God promising Abraham all of these blessings. And even when Abraham messes up and takes it into his own hand by having Ishmael, God is still being faithful and providing a son in Isaac. We see God guiding Isaac through some of the same mistakes that his father made, and yet living a life of faithfulness all the way through. We see God guiding Joseph even as well. Through his escape from his brother, through his battle with his uncle Laban, through his return to Esau and Esau's forgiveness of him, through the famine in the land, through his kids slaughtering the town of Shechem. That even in the ups and downs, God was still faithful. That God has been the shepherd all the days of his life, the angel who has delivered him from all harm. Now look back at your own life. Where do you see God's faithfulness? I know for me, I can look back and see family members who have broken cycles within our family, who have led lives of faithfulness, although not without pain. I look back and see the ups and downs of my own life, me deciding and realizing the call to be a pastor, and then very quickly after going into spiritual stagnation, needing God to draw me out of that. What is God's faithfulness in your life? How do we see God working in our lives specifically? And the faithfulness of fulfilled promises. The first question that we asked was, in the good and bad, how do we see God working? This one, in the fulfilled promises, how do we see God working? He blesses these boys. He realizes the blessings that he actually is able to see his grandkids. And he prays the promise back on them. At the end of verse 16, may they increase greatly, echoing the very promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, what promises do you see God fulfilling in your life? Or what promises have you seen God fulfill in your life? As we move on to the last section here, we see an interesting inversion that was touched up on earlier. Verse 17, if you want to follow along, it says, when Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said to him, no, my father, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations. He blessed them that day and said, in your name will Israel pronounce his blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. He put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, I am about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. And to you I give one more ridge of land than to your brothers, the ridge I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow. And that is the end of the blessings to Ephraim and Manasseh, and the end of our passage. There's still so much to look at. You see, when Joseph brought his sons to Jacob, and Jacob inverted his arms to bless them, Joseph took issue with that. Maybe you could say Joseph was a little bit more of a traditionalist, or maybe he assumed that it was just an honest mistake. So he tries to correct Jacob's motion, grabbing his arm to move it back. And yet Jacob refuses and says, you know what, I'm doing what I want. This is what I desire to do. Jacob wants to bless Ephraim as the firstborn, as the one to get the birthright in place of Manasseh. This inversion, that the younger will be greater than the older. As an oldest kid, that doesn't quite feel as great to me. And this might ring of familiarity. We look at Cain and Abel, right? With Abel being the one desired by God, although being the younger. We look at Ishmael and Isaac. And Isaac, the younger one, being the one whom God had promised from beforehand. We look at Jacob and Esau, Jacob himself being the one who stole that birthright away. This idea that the younger is the one who God traces his history through is prevalent throughout the book of Genesis. And I love here that I believe Jacob looks and he sees his mistakes. Instead of forcing Ephraim to fight with Manasseh, he takes the initiative. Instead of Manasseh being cursed like Esau was by Isaac, Jacob says, oh, don't worry, he's going to be blessed too. He will also be great, just a little less. So why does he do this? Well, I think he's carrying after a tradition of God. Maybe making right his past as well. But we see God is the God who works through those from lesser means. God is the God who works from those who are forgotten, who are cast aside. As we said earlier, throughout history, we can see this with Abel being the one desired by God, even though he was younger. We see Abraham being desired by God, even though he wasn't from a large, well-known family of kings. We see Isaac being desired by God above his half-sibling who was conceived out of a desire to supplant God's promises. We see Hagar, the woman abused to bring about Ishmael, being protected by God in spite of her trauma. We see Leah, the unloved wife of Jacob, and yet his first wife, being blessed by God through children. And by the way, through the child through whom Jesus would come, Judah. We see Rachel being blessed by God through Joseph and Benjamin, her sons, when she was seemingly forgotten. We see Judah, the third born, being given the promise of the Messiah. We see Joseph, the 11th born, being used by God to save the world. We see Ephraim himself in this very passage, being blessed above his brother. We see Moses, a child born to a slave family hidden away, not the firstborn of his own household, but led the people of Israel under God. We see Gideon from a small household in Israel during the time of the Judges. From nothing, coming before God, being used by God to raise up an army and being told, actually, pare down the army because I want the glory to go to me. God choosing to use the lesser. We see David, the youngest of his family, blessed and chosen to be king of all Israel. We see women like Rahab, Tamar, and Ruth. From sometimes sketchy pasts, Rahab being a prostitute who was welcomed into the lineage of Jesus from a rival nation. We see Tamar conceiving and bearing kids through a sinful act brought about by, in partnership, her father-in-law. We see Mary, the mother of Jesus herself, of little repute. Joseph, Jesus' stepfather. We see the disciples, most come from nothing, and yet invited to work with Jesus in his ministry. We see Jesus himself, born in a humble estate. And we can see us. You see, God works through those who might be forgotten. God works through those who might not have the means of others. God works through those who are not expected to be great. And yet through us, his glory is shown. One of my favorite passages in the entire Bible, and actually the verse that I center a lot of my ministry around, is 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10, which says, Paul writing, "But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." That's a bold claim. God's power is made perfect in our weakness. Why is that? Well, I know if I can work for God, that it wasn't me, it was God who did the amazing thing. So Paul continues on saying, "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness. I will boast and I will brag about the things that I am not good at, because it shows that God was the one working in that time, so that Christ's power may rest upon me." He ends saying, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." Because that is when God truly works. That is when God's glory truly shines, and is when he can work through us, broken people, that he can work through us, people who oftentimes are without means, oftentimes without status. This idea of inversion, blessing the younger over the older, blessing the one who is born without means over them who has means, it's traced all throughout. And through that, we see God's glory magnified. We rely on him. So, Ephraim and Manasseh are blessed. Ephraim being given the right of the firstborn. And we actually see in the book of Chronicles that Ephraim is actually the one to whom the right of the birthright is given. Not to Judah, not to Reuben, not to any of the other actual biological sons of Jacob, but to his grandsons who he adopted. Ephraim is the one who has that. When the nation of Israel split between the tribes of Judah and the other 11, guess what the other 11 tribes are called oftentimes? Ephraim. God followed his promise to make Ephraim great, to bring nations and peoples under his wing. Fun fact, Joshua, the one who led Israel back into the land of Canaan, was an Ephraimite. He was from Ephraim. Samuel, the one to whom God used in the beginning of the monarchy, the last judge of Israel, the one whom God used to call and anoint David, the king who was after God's heart, he was from Ephraim. Even Jeroboam, the one who led the split between Israel and Judah, was from Ephraim himself. You see, this blessing carries on, and we can actually see it take part in the history of Israel. Great peoples coming from this grandkid of Jacob, the second born of at least Joseph. God working through those who don't come from the prime status. And finally, Israel comments to Joseph that he is about to die, but God will bring them back to the land. And we see in 400 years that happens. He's looking far ahead. And he gives the land of Shechem, most likely, taken by his kids under violent assault, to Ephraim and Manasseh, seemingly as a way to keep it from the two who conquered the land to begin with. So, how do we see God working in our lives? How do we see God tracing through human history, working for our good? How do we see God in our lives, specifically when we are less than privileged? For me, it's through salvation. All of these names that I mentioned led to Jesus, who lived a life born into poverty but lived in perfection, dying for us so we can live with him forever in glory. And all we have to do is to believe in him, to take that step of faith. So, how do you see God working in your life? How do you see his faithfulness throughout all generations carrying on? I want you guys to consider that as we close in prayer. God, thank you so much for this day and this time. We pray your blessing over us. Guide us as we live for you. Lord, bring to our memories, to our recollection, the time that you have worked in our lives, the times that you have worked in the lives of people we love and care about, to remind us that even in the ups and downs, you are there, that you are present and you are working. Pray this in your name. Amen.